Thank you very much for joining us today to discuss the potential for a community wealth fund in Scotland. My name's Craig Wilson. I'm in the public affairs team at the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations. And today we're delighted to be joined by Matt Leach, who is CEO of the local trust, who are in turn driving the Community Wealth Fund Alliance at an English level. So at the outset, I just want to say that we are recording today's event. If anyone is uncomfortable with being recorded or on the screen, feel free to switch off your cameras. I'll also say that we will be breaking out into groups later on. Those sessions will not be recorded, so you can feel free to have at it and say what you want. But the event itself will be recorded, and that will hopefully be useful for casting the net a bit wider and doing some more engagement around this particular topic. We will not be having a Q&A session as such during the actual webinar part of this. As I said, there will be group sessions later on where people can speak freely, ask questions, and sort of pick each other's brains on this subject. But in the meantime, if you do want to use the chat function, you can do that. You can make comments, you can ask questions, and we'll try to flag those up as we go along. They will hopefully try and guide our discussion slightly, and hopefully towards the end, if we have got some time, we can maybe pick up on some more specific issues. So just quickly, I'd just like to run over the rationale for why we're having this session today before we really get stuck into the conversation. So fundamentally, this is a bit of a scoping exercise. As you'll hear from Matt, the concept of a community wealth fund is quite well advanced in England. The concept's perhaps better established and understood in other parts of the UK. And in Scotland, we're really not at that stage yet. In fact, we don't know if there is that understanding, and we don't know what it could look like in Scotland, if it would look different from other parts of the UK. And also, we don't know if there is an appetite. So essentially, this is a chance to kill two birds with one stone. We want to hear from Matt directly about the work that the Community Wealth Fund Alliance are doing, what a community wealth fund is and what it could look like. It also gives us a chance to ask questions of Matt, of each other, about how we think it could look in Scotland, if it's something we need. And it gives us a chance to give that sort of tentative thumbs up or thumbs down as to whether this is something we should pursue in a bit more detail. So as I said, we will break into those facilitated groups for 15-20 minutes or so. We're also going to have a couple of polls throughout the session, which will give people a chance to sort of put forward their view on whether this is a conversation that's going in the right direction or not. Of course, none of this is legally binding. It's not a referendum. You will not be held liable for any views. This is simply a conversation that we want to try and get off the ground to test the water a little bit and to decide on what we might want to do next. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Matt Leach from Local Trust to talk a little bit about Community Wealth Fund. Thanks, Matt.
Great, thanks so much for the invite to join you all. And I'm just going to share my screen now to just take you through a bit of a story as to who Local Trust is, what we do, some of the research we've been doing, and how that's led into conversations in England about the potential for a community wealth fund. I'll then talk a little bit about what it might be, what it might do, and then at the end, perhaps we'll come back to some conversations after the breakout groups around how perhaps we think it might be funded, certainly in England. But just to start with, and I'm going to apologize in advance for the number of slides I'm going to rip through. I'm going to do this at a rate. If you need any of this material, I'll share it with Craig and colleagues to distribute after the event. Local Trust is a big national endowment in England, funded by the National Lottery Community Fund. We run something called Big Local. Big Local is a massive experimental program. It's a 15-year program which is aimed to put £1 million in each of 150 communities around England to spend on anything they want over 10 to 15 years. These are places like the Firs and Bromford estates on the edge of the M6, Dyke House in Hartlepool, a community that's still suffering from the loss of the docks in the 1960s, Kirkholt in Rochdale, an estate on the edge of a former northern industrial town, or Chatham, the Luton Arches there, an estate on the edge of a failing, I guess, former coastal area or coastal industrial area in the southeast of England. And the idea of the program is essentially that we go in, we bring a community together, which perhaps has not been as successful as others in attracting money in or creating community organization, and say you can have £1 million provided you organize yourselves, consult with local people on what their priorities are, work together and come up with a shared plan, a vision for the area. And then over that period, you can draw on the money to deliver your vision for the area. And the sorts of stuff that we've seen happen is, it's amazing, from starting with small scale events, kind of community enrichment, small grants to get stuff going in places where perhaps stuff isn't happening, through to community hubs, community gardening projects, even in one case, the reopening of historic Victorian boating lake in Stalybridge near Manchester. In some cases, some real community growth, moving communities from a place where they were campaigning against abandoned derelict sites to a point where they could take on ownership of community assets, then start to get into becoming their own landlords, building new social housing, and now looking to finance a lot of their work through the creation of a solar farm next to their estate. So an interesting program which trusts local people, which looks to build their capacity and confidence over the long term, and take them from a place where perhaps the community centres were on their last legs, there wasn't a lot going on, grant money wasn't coming in, to a place where they feel confident that they can advocate for themselves, they can organise, and they can deliver their own solutions. And all the way around that, we run a whole amount of mentoring, leadership training, support, celebratory events to help them achieve as much as possible from the potential that we're offering them. But I guess one of the most important things for us about Big Local isn't just the experiment in seeing what communities can do if you trust them with resources, but also the extent to which it gives us a bit of a closer view across a whole range of different communities about what works and what doesn't, and what's difficult when it comes to turning communities around and addressing issues not just of economic levelling up, but increasingly around how you level up levels of social fabric, of social infrastructure in communities. And one of the things we found in particular in a lot of the areas that we were working was that where our starting point in an area and going in and saying, here's some money we'll put on the table, you can spend it on what you want with very little in the way of rules, you've just got to work together and make things happen. Where the starting point was that the social infrastructure was almost completely absent. At the start, the pubs were closed, the community centres were closed, there weren't places to meet, where levels of pre-existing community organisation were very low or non-existent. You had to start from scratch, where it felt like community had effectively disestablished itself, that actually it took a lot more time and a lot more effort and a lot more resource to get things going. That wasn't to say that communities in those situations couldn't achieve brilliant things. It just took a lot to rebuild social fabric where it disappeared. And we wanted to understand what was going on there. So we commissioned some guys called Oxy, who are the data nerds. This is being recorded, isn't it? So these are the data analysts who support MHCLG to create the Index of Multiple Deprivation in England, which is the primary determinant of allocation of resources by government on the basis of need in England, to investigate what was going on. And what we asked them to do was to look in particular whether they could create an index which looked at social infrastructure. So could we map and understand different levels of social infrastructure, places to meet, active and engaged communities, perhaps also connectedness in places, to see if we could identify where the places were that were like the places we had found it hardest to work, and then look at them to see if they had something in common. And we were looking at, are there places to meet? We mapped all the places to meet in the country. How connected are they? To what extent is there civic organisation taking place? And this was a pretty extensive exercise. We went and mined every single official bit of data we could go to. We mined the Ordnance Survey address base. We pulled together survey-based indicators of connectedness. We looked at how active communities were using some of the big participation studies that the government commissions on a regular basis. And we came up with this report that came out a couple of years ago. It's been updated once since, called Left Behind, which attempted to map the social infrastructure of England. And this is it at a local authority level, but much more interesting for us was to look at it at an MSOA level, at a ward-based level, and in particular to look at how it overlapped with deprivation. Because for us, the biggest challenges seemed to come in communities that were both very poor because the economy had failed, but also lacked social infrastructure, that these were the places where the challenges were. And when we put them on a map, we found some interesting ways of viewing parts of the country that have been worried about in the past, but perhaps not through the lens of the combination of deprivation and a loss of social fabric. We found a lot of the ex-mining villages and some of the post sort of communities on the edge of former industrial areas in the northeast fell into that category of poor in the worst 10% of the index of multiple deprivation, but also in the worst 10% of our new index of social fabric. We found the municipal housing estates, the council housing estates on the edge of the biggest cities and towns in the northwest, the places, you know, the estates on the edge of Runcorn, on the edge of Wigan, on the edge of Bolton, on the edge of Warrington. In the West Midlands, Yorkshire and the Humber, we found typically the kind of former coal mining villages were the ones that particularly seemed to be suffering from a hollowing out of social infrastructure alongside deprivation. So it wasn't the traditional deprived inner urban areas that a lot of social policy focuses on, rather it was the poor places on the edge. In the West Midlands, it was very much the estates on the edge of Birmingham, the estates on the edge of Stoke, often actually the places across all of these that also fell into what's been known as, become known as the Red Wall areas in the last election. And finally, some of the coastal areas in the southeast. Interestingly, very few, if any, of these communities fell into London or the centre of any of our major urban areas. And when we looked at these communities that we started looking for because they had a combination of deprivation and a lack of social fabric, what we found was these were places which had higher levels of unemployment, even when you adjusted for their relative levels of deprivation, where there were fewer jobs per head of the population compared to other equally deprived areas, the other worst 10% of the index of multiple deprivation, where people had much lower levels of education, where health problems were significantly worse. In fact, if you look at the most recent health crisis, these communities, which we started looking for because they were poor and because they lacked social fabric, in fact, these were the places which were most vulnerable to COVID. Interestingly, mutual aid was a big story in England, certainly during the COVID crisis, people coming together to support themselves. We found these were the communities which had the lowest levels of mutual aid, less than a third of those elsewhere in the country, but also as a consequence, suffered from much lower levels of emergency funding in terms of grant. And actually a lot of that comes down to the fact that there simply weren't people advocating for them, organising for them. There's a bunch of graphs here which shows you that in Left Behind communities, there were lower levels of community assets per head of the population. There's lower levels of charities compared to other equally deprived communities. And they're getting much lower levels of grant funding, whether absolutely or per head of the population. And Westminster, one of the largest new cross-party, all-party groups, has been set up to look at this issue of left behind neighbourhoods, and is meeting it monthly at the moment, and issued quite a lot of reports about this as an issue. So I guess, what's all this got to do with a community wealth fund? A lot of this is background. It's about talking about places that are left behind, the places on the periphery, the peripheral estates. Well, if you look at where these communities are, and I guess I showed you the maps earlier, a lot of them are in former industrial areas. We're talking about the former pottery, areas where there was the potteries, where the steel plants were, where the mines were, where the docks were. And I guess when those places fell apart, they lost their jobs, the shared workplaces, trade unions, the assembly rooms, the working men's clubs, the pubs that were supported by workers' incomes, often some of the social facilities that were self-funded by by those community-owned institutions, we brought in welfare benefits to save those communities from absolute poverty. We brought in a social care system, often actually putting a whole lot of resource in to cope with issues around health, around mental ill health that arose in those communities. But when it came to social fabric, which disappeared along with those industries that underpin those communities, actually there wasn't really anything that was done to support those communities through that transition. And our experience overwhelmingly working with deprived communities, post-industrial communities across England over the last 10 to 15 years through the Big Local programme is that if you're going to turn that around, it's no good just parachuting in short-term money. Actually, what you need is long-term support, hyperlocal support, money put in the hands of local people to enable them to start to rebuild the fabric of the places that they live in, to recreate, reopen the places where they can meet, to get community organizations going again. And when we talk about long-term, we're not talking about 3-year programs or 5-year programs. We're talking about 7, 10, 15-year programs to start to rebuild the fabric of the social fabric of left behind areas. And that's something that's become crystallized in this idea of a community wealth fund, that if we're going to start to turn around in England some of the places that really need levelling up, the places that have both lost out economically but also have seen their social fabric diminished, there's a need to put in money over the long term for government, or maybe we'll talk in a minute about dormant assets, or perhaps a blended fund involving corporate contributions, but something needs to be put together, an endowment which can commit money over the very long term to these communities. We're talking about putting money directly in the hands of local people and supporting them through a process of rebuilding community organization, building a shared vision, reinvesting in shared social infrastructure, getting community activities going, which are owned and located in the communities rather than delivered as services in from the outside, to help rebuild, alongside rebuilding the economy, because of course that needs to be done as well, but to help rebuild the social fabric of those places. And that's very much at the heart of the Community Wealth Fund campaign, which now brings together about 400 organizations, including most of the big combined authorities in England, a lot of top tier authorities elsewhere, probably like over 300 major not-for-profits, trusts and foundations, and more recently an interesting, although still small, number of private sector members, all to campaign to create this sort of fund to try to make a difference in those communities in England that need more than just economically levelling up. They need the regrowth and the reinvestment in their social infrastructure and their social fabric. I've no idea the extent to which that's relevant to you. I've been up and visited projects that Cora run in Scotland, which are fantastic. You've got a different economy, geography, demography, but perhaps this might form the basis for conversation around whether some or any of this is relevant to the challenges that you face. And that's me done. Over to you, Craig.
Great, Matt. Thank you very much. Yes, well, that was absolutely fascinating. Really great presentation. The research that underpins it is quite remarkable. I think you sold it short when you said it was quite a bit of work. It's really methodical, and it paints a remarkable picture. Certainly, it looks like there are communities that you could say sit below the normal stats and statistics as they're presented routinely. These are communities where, as you say, that social fabric has been completely stripped out completely, and normal funding and support just won't catalyse any change. There's nothing for it to grip onto. The community has essentially been hollowed out. I find it quite striking as well that on the face of it, Community Wealth Fund sounds something very third sector. It sounds like something we can all get involved in, but really this is not a fund for the sector as such. This is a fund for communities to essentially engender a new level of third sector that just doesn't exist.
I think that's right. I mean, I think there are two things that are important. I think the first is all of these communities that I identified as places on the map have got strengths. They've got people with potential. They've got people who want to make their communities better, but often they simply don't have the critical mass of community and social infrastructure to be able to advocate for themselves, to be able to organize themselves, to be able to access the sorts of grant funding that other places with well-established community organizations, obviously have to fight for. It's a resource-starved environment, but are much more able to access. So it's about long-term capacity and confidence building. The sort of thing, there used to be a rich tradition of community development in England, and I'm sure in Scotland as well, that sought to build things from the bottom up within communities, and it's been rather lost since the loss of the big area regeneration programs 10 or 20 years ago. I think what's critically important when we talk about a community wealth fund is talking about some way of putting money somewhere which can be guaranteed as a delivery mechanism into communities beyond economic cycles. So it's not reliant on the local government or the national government electoral cycle, but can be depended upon and invested over 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I did say we wouldn't do Q&A, but there's a couple of sort of comments and questions sort of trickling in, and I'll maybe just try and address those before we move into the group chats. But the term sort of cold spots is being used, areas where you would expect to see a lot of applications or a lot of need for support, just nothing coming out of them, which suggests there is that sort of black hole there where there is no one mobilizing anything in the community to access that support. But also a question here about, and you did mention it in terms of sort of corporate, the corporate angle to things, about local businesses. Can they be that foothold for people? Can they begin to engender that sort of community spirit for people to build around? Is that something that has to be done sector and business together, do you think?
I guess when the Community Wealth Fund was put together as an idea, and this is pre-COVID crash, part of the thought was that perhaps if government was to put dormant assets on the table, and again, I know in our agenda we're going to talk about that a little later, that might provide a basis for looking to perhaps lever in large-scale match funding from corporates who wanted to make a difference in the places it's hard to make a difference. And I think, it's impossible not to overstate the extent to which some of our current models of funding of community and third sector activity, certainly in England, serve to increase polarization of access to wealth and resources. So a community ownership fund, for example, which is brilliant, is happening in England at the moment. It's looking to fund community ownership of assets. It's a 4-year fund, which means that the sorts of communities that are going to be able to access it overwhelmingly will be those that already have business plans in place and are ready to go, rather than those communities that might need 5 or 6 years to get to a point where they have the confidence and skills to be able to start to think about taking on assets in their neighborhoods, which leaves them potentially, those types of neighborhoods, even further behind. So I think we're relaxed about absolute models and are more interested in how you can create a principle of very long-term funding and access sources of support which are not dependent on 3 or 5 year treasury or electoral funding cycles.
Okay. That is a whirlwind from Matt there, to give us all a sense of what a community wealth fund sort of is and what it could look like. At this stage, just based on Matt's presentation, based on what you have discussed in your groups, we are going to offer up a poll at this stage just to see what we're all thinking. So the question is, would you support further discussion around a community wealth fund for Scotland? And that looks like it's going to be unanimous, which is always good. So certainly we're over, yes, 19 of our 24 respondents there. 19 of the 24 people here today have answered the poll, and 100% have agreed that this is a conversation that they would like to keep going, which is a sort of North Korean result. I distrust 100% results, but on this occasion, I'm happy with it. But certainly, I mean, as we said, this is a very initial discussion, so I think the idea of exploring these details in exploring these issues in a bit more detail is essential, and I'm pleased to see that everyone broadly agrees with that. I'm going to bring Matt back in again here just to talk a little bit about the $1 million question, or the $100 million question, however much it is. But how do we fund this? Is this this will not be funded through Scotch Mist? There will need to be money that comes from somewhere. And certainly, Matt, your thinking around this has been around the Dormant Assets Fund, which I can very quickly run over that. 2010, I believe it was, the Dormant Bank Accounts Fund was introduced, and essentially it is what it says on the tin. It was bank accounts had lain dormant for over a period of time, brought together into a central reclaim fund by the UK government, and then distributed on a per capita share to the nations of the United Kingdom. In Scotland, that money, I believe, went to the National Lottery Community Fund and has primarily funded youth work programmes since then. There is an expansion of the dormant bank account scheme to include assets, which will include pensions, insurance, stocks and shares, you name it. So it's going to be a much wider fund, which is obviously inevitably going to bring in more money. That is currently going through Westminster as we speak. So it's quite
debated today, in fact, at the House of Lords.
Yeah. Well, you would think I'd timed it, but I really didn't. So that conversation is ongoing at Westminster. We believe it is going to be a relatively straightforward process that will just continue and expand the system as is. But really, this is quite an opportune time for us to be having this discussion. Is this new fund, this new expanded fund, perhaps the solution to how a community wealth fund could be funded? At this stage, we're simply having a conversation as to whether we think it's a good idea or not exactly how we fund it. But if Matt, you could perhaps maybe just touch on this idea. It certainly came up in our groups about an endowment, about this long-term, beyond the political cycle type of funding. If you could just touch on that,
well,
please.
I think we were attracted to the idea of dormant assets in part because it's long-term money that isn't owned by Treasury, that can sit aside and provide certainty. And you can certainly see over periods which would make a difference to communities that needed long-term investment. And you can certainly see in the previous wave of the current wave of dormant assets, bank account money, that the ability to have access to money over the long term has made a difference, for example, in terms of Big Society Capital and its social finance, establishing a social finance market because there has been money going into social investment and Big Society Capital in particular as a wholesaler over the medium to long term. Looking forward, the next wave of money is quite significant in kind of global terms. Although government in its consultation or in its conversations prior to the Dormant Assets Bill that's currently before Parliament, had talked about 700 million coming in that might be the next wave of funding. That's in total across all the nations. The experts that we've talked to are suggesting that actually the number is much more likely to be close to 4.7 billion. So very big money indeed. And on a scale which might suggest that the existing purposes to which it's being committed, which is young people, financial inclusion advice, and social finance, might need to be added to by some other purposes. We've looked to the Community Wealth Fund campaign has been advocating for government to commit to this on the face of legislation, to actually say, yes, we will consult on purposes, but community infrastructure, social infrastructure is one new purpose that we will put on the face of the bill. And a number of members of the House of Lords have been advocating for that in debate on the bill. Government, to be fair, has been very consistent in saying that it simply wants to open up the possibility of other purposes and to have a general consultation on purposes next year after the bill has concluded its passage through Parliament. And we'd be quite happy to make our case then as well, but the certainty of having a commitment on the face of primary legislation would be useful. In terms of what that means for Scotland's share of dormant assets, I mean, I guess that's for Scotland to decide. Clearly it could go through the lottery and go to existing projects, or you could perhaps come up with another idea to do something longer term and more strategic, perhaps owned by the sector itself, that might reflect some of our thinking on a community wealth fund, which to date has been very much for England. I know in Wales there are organisations of Wales that have joined our community wealth fund campaign, but are similarly thinking about actually what would it mean in terms of, you know, what might happen in within the Welsh nation. And I think you're much better placed to have a view on that collectively than I might ever.
I think, yeah, there's certainly an interesting dynamic in the fact that this, you know, the main pot is subsequently barneted in some way. You know, Scotland, if you're talking £700 million, we're talking roughly £60 million for Scotland, which, you know, is, as you say, a significant amount of money that perhaps requires a bit of fresh thinking on what is done with it. I think we could be at risk of straying into quite technical territory about how we fund things. I think the conversation we've had around the concept and learning a bit about that has been really, really fruitful. But I will throw another poll at people just to see if there is any consideration on this. So the discussion on the Community Wealth Fund for Scotland and how we fund it, should that, do you believe, centre around the Dormant Assets Fund, which, as we mentioned, is going through Parliament, or should we explore entirely different funding options and things sort of carry on as normal, or a mixture of both? Is this something that we can perhaps hive off some of the dormant assets money, or is it a conversation we should just have in a completely separate channel altogether and find other ways to fund it?
And I think, to be fair, Craig, in our campaign, we've never advocated that all of the dormant assets money should go to a community wealth fund. Okay. Just that it should be that it should be an additional purpose that should be obviously significantly funded, but not own all of the next wave of assets.
Excellent. Okay, a fairly comprehensive result on that again. 2 people very clearly of the belief that it should solely centre around Dormant Assets Fund, but 16 people, 90% of people saying that we should explore both that and other funding options. So certainly keeping everything on the table at this stage. We do have a few minutes left, so if we've got 5 minutes, I note that Roddy, I think from the lottery, has his hand up. Roddy, would you like to make a point there? I think you're on mute, sorry.
Stop behaving myself. Just so you understand how some of that moves factually, so the direction of how the current assets are allocated in Scotland is subject to Scottish ministers providing the policy direction for that. And assuming that that process followed, you would expect Scottish ministers to decide how a new dormant assets resource would be allocated. That's obviously assuming that it followed that model of devolution, but we're looking at a UK government investment strategy just now where there are strands which are bypassing the devolved administrations. So there's no guarantee that dormant assets would follow the devolution model and could follow the thinking that this is something that Westminster would want to administer themselves. So in terms of moving into that arena and deciding that that's a place where this type of fund could be met from, I think it's important that people understand where those decisions might likely be made.
I think that's a really good point, Roddy, and we were quite alive to that. We have contacted Baroness Barron, who is the minister in charge of this fund, and she did in writing say that it would continue to follow the same model that the Dormant Bank Accounts fund has followed, as in it will be devolved and there will be that decisions made by Scottish ministers. There will be a mathematical equation to decide how much is allocated to Scotland. So certainly it's something to be alive to, but as we understand it, it will continue to follow that model. But that's a really useful clarification on how these decisions are made. Thank you.
Yeah, the current ratings suggest that at the moment, but that could be changed by whim of government, I would suggest.
Yeah, that's a familiar one, yeah. Would anyone else like to make a quick point just before we bring things to a close? I see no hands at this stage. Well, with that then, I'd like to first of all thank Matt for taking the time to be here today, for giving us an excellent presentation, which I believe has been shared in the chat, but I'll also make sure that everyone gets a copy of that afterwards. As we said, a very initial conversation today, so I do expect we will be back in touch with you about any future events or next steps that we decide to take. But I think a really useful conversation today, certainly a lot of strong opinion that we should continue that conversation, and we look forward to doing so with you. So thank you very much, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the invite.